So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now, therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it into pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on wood, and put no fire to it. And you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered, "It is well spoken." Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourself 1 bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it." And they took the bull that was given to them, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made, and at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." And they cried aloud and cut themselves after the custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him, and he prepared the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the 12 tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench about the altar, as great as it would contain 2 seahs of seed. And he put the wood in order, and cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. And at that time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all of these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned, and that you have turned their hearts back." Sorry. Then fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell to their faces and said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." And Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Let none of them escape." And they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon and slaughtered them there. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up and eat and drink, for there is a sound of a rushing rain." So Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went down to the top of Mount Carmel, and he bowed himself down on the earth and put his face between his knees. And he said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." He went up and looked and said, "There's nothing." And he said, Go again, 7 times. And at the 7th time he said, Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea. And he said, Go up and say to Ahab, Prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you. And in a little while the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel, and the hand of the Lord was upon Elijah, and he gathered up his garment and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel.
Thank you, Robert. Go ahead, take a seat. So I want you to think a little bit about your life. I want you to think about maybe your relationships. If you're married, think about your marriage. But if you're not married, or in addition to being married, I assume you have other relationships with your children, with your parents, with your friends, siblings, with your coworkers. Think about your relationships, okay? And think about how they're doing. Think about your career. How is your career going? I think about maybe your financial situation, your physical health. Just kind of think about your life. And what we're going to do in just a minute here is I'm going to show 2 pictures, and I want you to say, okay, which of these pictures best reflects my life? Best reflects my relationships, best reflects where I think my career is, best reflects my health, spiritual health, physical health. Okay, so you got this, you got this in your mind. Okay, here's the first picture. Here we go. Okay, lush, green, thriving, right? Does that describe your health spiritually, physically? Does it describe the way you're feeling about your career or your relationships, your marriage, right? Green, water, just life, vibrant. Okay, that's the first one. Or how about this, second picture? Dry, desert, stagnant, dead. Which of those 2 pictures reflects your life? Today we're continuing in our series, the series we've been in now for several months, the series called The Story. And the central idea of this whole series is that if you want to understand any passage in the Bible, you've got to understand how it fits into the overarching story of the Bible. That the Bible is a story. It's not primarily an instruction manual for life. It's not primarily a book of timeless truths, though it contains all of the instructions you'd ever need. It contains all of the truths that you would ever need in life. But to get at those truths, to get at those instructions from any given passage, you have to set the passage within the overarching narrative of that is the Bible. And so we've been looking at this story, and it unfolds, as we've seen, roughly speaking, in 4 acts. You can summarize the entire Bible as a story that unfolds in 4 acts. Creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Creation, God created everything. He created it good. He created humanity in His image to reflect His goodness and His beauty. He created humanity to continue the process of bringing order and beauty to all of creation. That's creation. But then there's the fall. We decided, you know what, we're not sure we want to go with God's plan. We want to kind of pursue things on our own. We want to take matters into our own hands. And so we get the fall. We turn away from God. And when we turn away from God, this naturally leads to us turning away from one another. Separation from God leads to separation from one another. And so then what we find in Genesis chapter 3 through 11 is what I like to call the spiraling decay of humanity. Things just get worse and worse and worse as we move farther and farther away from God. Okay, so that's creation and fall. And then we get the third act is redemption, which comes in Genesis chapter 12. Most of the Bible actually is really about Act 3. And in Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abraham and calls him and says, through you and through your descendants, I will bring blessing to the nations. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. In other words, I'll protect you so that you can be the means through which blessing comes to all of the nations. Okay, so that promise comes to Abraham. And then it runs into a little bit of a hitch, right? We discover that his descendants, Jacob and his sons, they find themselves in Egypt because of a famine. And that starts out pretty good, actually, when they first go to Egypt. But then the authorities in Egypt change, and they start to not like the Israelites so much, and so they enslave the Israelites. So we get the Israelites in slavery in Egypt. And so what does God do? God rescues the rescuers. Remember we talked about this, that he delivers them from Egypt, not just for their sake, right, but to get the plan back on track. They're the ones through whom blessing is to come to the nations. So he rescues the rescuers, but leads them out of Egypt. And then we read in the book of Joshua about them coming into the promised land. We looked at that, I think, last week or a couple weeks ago. They come into the promised land. And then we, I guess that was probably 2 weeks ago, because then last week we looked at how God gives them the kingdom, the Davidic kingdom. The united kingdom in Israel, and David becomes the king, right? But then pretty quickly that doesn't go well. There's all kinds of infighting there, and the kingdom divides. It divides into two kingdoms, the north and the south, and that leads us to this particular passage that we are in now. And that is, now we're dealing with this time where they are in this divided kingdom, the north and the south, and Ahab is the king of the northern kingdom. Now, here's what we need to remember. The people of Israel, what was important about them being the means through which blessing comes to the nations, God's blessing to the nations, is that they worship God. They've got to worship God. They've got to worship the God that delivered them out of Egypt. So when they were enslaved in Egypt and God delivered them, God gave Moses this name. He said, "My name is Yahweh." That's what you should call me, is Yahweh. And what we discover is that in English translations, anytime you see the word Lord, L-O-R-D, in capital letters, that is translating the Hebrew word Yahweh. And the idea here is that the people of Israel were to be dedicated to the Lord. But what happens? Well, they do exactly what their great-great-great-great-grandfather Adam did, and they fall. They turn away from Yahweh as well. And that's what leads us to this particular passage that we are in now. The people of Israel have turned away from Yahweh and are now looking to worship another god, the god Baal. And so what we find in this particular scene is that Elijah, the prophet Elijah, he's kind of calling them out. Because actually kind of what they're doing is they like to waver back and forth. Like they're like, well, we really should worship Yahweh, but we also like worshiping Baal. So maybe we can kind of double dip. You know what I mean? So basically what Elijah does here is he calls them and he says, look, you've got to decide who is it that you're actually going to have allegiance to. You can't be double dipping, right? This is what emerges here in verse 21 of chapter 18. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people did not answer him a word. Right? So here he's like, you got to decide. It's a little bit like, like if you're dating two women and you're like, well, I like her. She's whatever. I love brunette and I love her eyes and she's really sweet. Oh, but then there's this other girl. And I like her too. She's blonde and she's funny. And so I'm kind of dating them both. Like, no, look, man, you've got to be committed to one or the other here. And in the same sense, he said, you've got to do that with God. Either you're going to worship God, he's the one you're committed to, or you're going to worship Baal. You can't keep limping back and forth, right? And I love this image of limping, right? It's this idea of like you can't really be fully in. You're just sort of hobbling around. And so he challenges them to decide which one to commit to. And then, of course, what he does, he says, look, let's put up a test, and let's just see which of these two gods really does come through. Let me help you out. You're having a tough time deciding. let me just demonstrate for you why you should worship Yahweh and not Baal. So we get this whole test with the sacrifice. They build up the altar, and it's going to be see who is going to be able to send fire down on this altar. Who's going to be able to do it? Yahweh or Baal? Okay, now, first thing we need to see from this is that this test that Elijah sets up here, it is not a test simply about which God exists. So this is not just, okay, is it Yahweh that exists or is it Baal that exists? The truth is, like, this idea of thinking about does the God exist or not, that's not really how the ancient people thought. They didn't really think that way. The way they thought, they didn't think in terms of existence. That's kind of like a Greek way of thinking that would kind of come later. The way they thought was like, okay, what God can do something? They didn't sit around philosophizing so much about what gods do or don't exist. To them, it was like, does it actually do anything? Can it accomplish anything? In fact, biblical scholars kind of debate in Old Testament times whether or not the Hebrew people were truly monotheists or if they were just henotheists. And monotheism is the belief that really just one God exists. There only is one God that exists. Henotheism is, well, there might be other gods around, but our God's the only one that does anything. I mean, maybe they're around, maybe they're not, but we are committed to this God because he's the one that does something. And so primarily what is of issue here is which God can actually do something. Now, you might think I'm kind of splitting hairs here, talking about monotheism versus henotheism, believing does the God exist versus does the God do something. But the reason why I think this is important is because if you end up being a person who just simply believes that God exists, you can have a kind of belief in which you believe God exists, but it has absolutely no bearing on your actual life. There are no implications for how you actually live your life. And we actually see this. Let me give you an example of this, or I think a way in which we can see this, a rather stark example how this point is drawn out, this different way of thinking. Is that in the book of James, okay, James highlights the fact that demons have good theology. Demons believe in the one true God, right? Let me read this to you. This is James chapter 2. It says, you believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. His point is, you might have good theology. I believe in the one God. He's the one God who exists. Okay, great. The demons believe that. So what's so special about that? The issue is, do you trust that God to do something? Do you trust that God to save? Do you trust that God to be at work in your life and in your world? So it becomes a whole lot more practical. You might say it this way. The Israelites, in some respects, may have been they may have been philosophical polytheists, but practical monotheists. What I mean by that is that the ancient Israelites may have actually thought there were other gods around, but practically they only put their trust in one God, the one God who actually does things. Where the irony is that many Americans today, Christians, I would say that we are philosophical monotheists, meaning if I show you the doctrine of faith, you're going to say, yes, I believe there's only one God. But here's the truth. Practically, we worship all kinds of gods. We worship all kinds of gods because there are all kinds of things that we look to give us life. So philosophically, we are monotheists, but practically we're polytheists because we worship a ton of gods. So the point here, and we're going to come back to that here in a minute, the test here is not simply which God exists. The test that Elijah is drawing up here is not simply about which God exists, and it's also not simply about which God has the power to do miraculous things. We might think that, right? I mean, this whole thing kind of seems like a big show, like let's build up this big altar and see which one can send fire down, I don't know, just some sort of big fireworks display, because the truth is, okay, that's cool, you can do that, that's all, it's just kind of fun. Whoa, look at the power that he's got there, and so we might think that this is just a test to see who can do miraculous things. But actually, when we look at this in the broader context, this is one of the reasons why poor Robert had to read that entire section, is I wanted us to be able to see the broader context. When we see this whole test in light of the broader context, here's what we discover. Broader context reveals that the issue is who is the giver of life. It's not simply who can do, special effects. It's not just who can put on a pyrotechnics show. The question here, what's really at stake here is, who is the God that can actually give you life? Now, where do we see this? Well, it's the broader context that shows this. Here's what we need to recognize about what's going on in this time. At the time of this test, there has been a drought going on for 3.5 years. There has been no substantial rainfall for 3.5 years, and it has gotten desperate. In fact, we read about how desperate it is just in chapter 17. Right before this, we read about Elijah, the prophet Elijah, going to visit the Zarephath woman, this woman from Zarephath, and he asks her for some bread. He wants some bread from her, and this is how she responds to him. And she said, "As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." There has been no rain, which means there has been no crop yield, which means that there's no food. And so here is this lady saying, "I don't have anything for you. Me and my son, we're about to finish the last bit that we have, and then we're going to die." That's what's going on here, all right? So at the end, trust me, these folks don't care about just lightning coming out of the sky and setting something on fire. When you're about to die from starvation, you're not impressed by pyrotechnics. No, this is a question of who can actually give life. It's a matter of life and death. You're not looking for just some kind of spiritual experience to get you all fired up. You're not looking for God to just kind of show himself in some fancy, miraculous way. You're looking for who can actually provide for you. And Elijah prophesied, actually, that this drought would happen. He said this would happen. He said it's going to stop raining because the people of Israel have turned away from God. And Ahab, who's the king, Ahab actually knows this. Ahab knows that this drought has happened because the people of God have turned away from Yahweh. He knows this. Okay, so why isn't he acknowledging this? Why won't Ahab recognize what's so plainly before him, that the reason why this is happening is because he, and then they follow the leader, the people have turned away from Yahweh. Why is he not acknowledging this? And here's why. Because Ahab is whipped. Ahab is whipped. Ahab has met a girl, and that girl has got him whipped. Guys, ever met a girl and she got you whipped? You know what I mean? To be whipped is when you start doing things you never would have done before. You start acting like a totally different person after you've met this girl. I know this because when I met Laura Wilkins, I got whipped. I grew up in a family. I grew up in a household where we listened to classical music, okay? Mozart, that's as light as we get. Usually it's more like Wagner. That's what we like. My dad and I will go to the Met, listen to a 6-hour Wagner opera. That's Hanley music, okay? Here's what the Hanleys do not do. They do not listen to country music. No country music. At least we didn't. Till I met Laura Wilkins. Now you give me some Zach Brown, Antebellum. I mean, just keep them coming. I love me some country music. You know why? Because I'm whipped. I got whipped. Start acting in ways that are not the way I used to be. And that's what's going on with Ahab. Ahab met a girl named Jezebel, and she's got him whipped. Here's the problem with Jezebel. Here's the thing about Jezebel. Jezebel is evil to the core, but she's amazing, apparently. Evil to the core, but amazing. She's from Sidon. So you've probably all heard about the Sidonian woman, right? Ooh, the Sidonian woman. Y'all know the song, right? Sidonian woman, stay away from me. Sidonian woman, mama, let me be. Don't come hanging around my door. I don't want to see your face no more. Colored lights can hypnotize. Sparkle someone else's eyes. Now, woman, get away. Sidonian woman, listen what I say. Y'all know about the Sidonian woman, right? And so he's fallen for the Sidonian woman. She's got him whipped, and so now she has got him worshiping other gods. And so Israel is following the leader, and so they are all worshiping other gods as well. They are worshiping Baal and Asherah, his female consort god. And so this whole scene here, this whole thing with Elijah and the altar and this test, it's really all just designed to get the people of Israel to snap out of this trance. The Sidonian woman has got them whipped, has got them in this trance, and it's all designed to just try to get them to snap out of it. Here's my question for each one of us here today. Are we under the trance of the Sidonian woman? Have we been drawn and tempted to worship other gods? And I would suggest that when you look at America as a whole, we are under the trance of the Sidonian woman. It's almost as if the Sidonian woman has been reincarnated as the American woman. Maybe we should rewrite that song, and it should be called American Woman, Stay Away From Me, because it seems as though we Americans have similarly been brought under this trance that is pulling us towards worshiping other gods. Because what really is a god? Do you know what a god is? A god is anything you look to for life. In the end, that's what a god is. It's what you look to in order to give you life. And so my question is, are we worshiping other gods? And when I say that, again, I'm not questioning your orthodoxy, right? If I give you a statement of faith, no, Jesus is my God, God alone. Okay, but your orthopraxy, in other words, what do you practically look to give you life? Beyond just what you supposedly believe philosophically, what do you actually look to give you life? Okay, what are some of these gods? What are the gods of the American woman? What are the gods that the American woman has got us in a trance over and is pulling us towards? I'm going to name some gods, okay? And I'm going to kind of name them the same way that Elijah says you got to decide, right? You can't keep wavering between Yahweh and Baal. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to mention some American gods. Here we go. And here's how you're going to know. Here's how you're going to know that you worship this God. When I read this list, what makes you uncomfortable? Right? Because you're going to be tempted like, I don't worship that. Okay, but what, come on, what kind of, something in you gets a little bit nervous when I mention this. Are you ready? Here we go. You cannot worship both God and money, God and shopping, God and your house. You cannot worship God and sex, God and relationships, God and marriage, God and career, God and success, God and power. You cannot worship both God and control, God and reputation, God and morality, or God and moral reputation. You cannot worship both God and music, God and artistic expression. You cannot worship both God and food, God and alcohol. You cannot worship both God and entertainment, God and football, God and video games, God and Netflix. You cannot worship both God and recreation, God and vacation, God and retirement, God and entertainment. You cannot worship both God and body image, God and fitness, God and health. You cannot worship both God and democracy, God and the Republican Party, God and the Democratic Party, God and country. You cannot worship God and family, God and children. I could keep going. What made you uncomfortable? Well, let me help you out a little bit more as we try to identify. Because maybe I managed to skip over your God. Okay, well, let's try some tests here. 3 idolatry tests. And here's how you know that this has become a God of yours, or potentially might be bordering on a God for you. What dominates your thinking? What dominates your emotions? And what dominates your sacrifices? So first of all, what dominates your thinking? What are the things that is all consuming in your thought life? And we see this actually, if we look at this story, we see that the priests of Baal, they are consumed with the thought of Baal. Notice this here, verse 26. And they took the bull that was given, and they prepared it, and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. You see, that's where their thoughts are. Tim Keller puts it this way. He says, the true God of your heart is what your thoughts effortlessly go to when there is nothing else demanding your attention. Right? Practically speaking, your God is what consumes your thoughts. Okay, that's the first test. What dominates your thinking? Secondly, what dominates your emotions? We see here the priests of Baal, they get all emotional as well. And they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation. But there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. Right? So they get all emotional, they get all excited. So for you, what are the things that get you all emotional? Like, what makes you angry? What gets you angry? What gets you sad? When you can't have something, what really makes you sad? See, whatever dominates your emotions just might be bordering on the line of idolatry. What dominates your thinking, what dominates your emotions, and finally, what dominates your sacrifices? Verse 28, and they cried aloud again and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. Right? So this points to what do we sacrifice? What are the things that you're willing to sacrifice your time for? Maybe you're even willing to sacrifice your health for it. You're willing to sacrifice your money for it. It's so important to you that you don't care if it harms your health. You don't care if it takes all your money. You don't care if it steals your time. Maybe you don't even care if it requires your integrity. You'll sacrifice your integrity. It's so important to you. What dominates your thinking? What dominates your emotions? And what dominates your sacrifices? And see, here's what Elijah wants us to see. He wants us to see what is it that happens when we worship other gods. What kind of a life does it ultimately lead to? Of course, here's the central point that emerges here. Your gods will fail you. Whatever it is that you are willing to sacrifice for, whatever it is that gets you all riled up, whatever it is that dominates your thing, whatever it is that you turn to, it will fail you. Just like Baal fails them in this test. So at the beginning of the service, I showed you two pictures. I showed you a picture of a lush, beautiful trees, and I showed you a picture of a desert, and I asked you to reflect upon what best represents your life. And if you picked the desert for anything, if you picked the desert, is it possible the reason why you picked the desert, is it possible that at least in part, the reason why it feels so dead is because you are looking to false gods to give you life? That's why you're in the desert. You are looking to things that ultimately cannot give you life. Ultimately, they can only lead to dryness and ultimately death. Elijah calls to God. The flame consumes the altar. And we discover that the Israelites then turn to God. They turn away from God, the false god of Baal, and they turn to Yahweh. And then what happens, right? See, this is where we get to the central point here. In chapter 18, verse 45. And in a little while, the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. Friends, the heart of the Christian faith is that only Yahweh can bring the rain. Only God can give you the water that you need. Only God can give you life. Friends, what are you worshiping today? What are the things that you look to give you life? They will fail you. But God will not fail you. Is it possible that the answer is really very simple? The answer is that we need to surrender our lives to God. We need to surrender our lives to the only one who can truly give us life. The heart of the Christian faith is that in the person of Jesus, God demonstrated his unbelievable love for us and his unsurpassable power. On the cross, we see a God that is willing to give anything for us. Your career will not die for you. Your money will not die for you. Your hobbies will not die for you. Your retirement won't die for you. Your house won't die for you. Only God, as seen in Jesus, loves you so much that he would die for you. This is a God you can trust. And in the resurrection of Jesus, we see that this is a God who not only has control over the rain, but has control over life and death itself. You know, you can't totally blame the Israelites for looking to Baal, because you know what Baal was? Within the Canaanite religious system, Baal was the god of rain, the god of thunder. So it kind of made sense. We're in the midst of a drought, let's look to the God of rain, except for there aren't separate gods for rain and thunder. There is only one God, and he is the God who in Jesus died for you and on the third day rose from the grave. Life is found in surrendering to him. We now come to our time of communion. What is communion? Communion is an opportunity to turn to the one true God.